week, I think we've had suggestions and volunteers for another 6 webinars. So please do keep the ideas coming. We will fit them all in. So just a reminder that this is an open forum which operates under a Creative Commons governance model. It's also a community without formal funding, so I just want to take a little time to acknowledge the contributions of my team at Kent State, including Jana Korzenko, our academic program coordinator, Nicole Stempak, and Jake Spiegler, our 2 graduate assistants. So now on to today's program. So I'd like to introduce to you all Gordon Vala Webb. I met Gordon, I think, about a year and a half ago at Stan Garfield's annual event in Washington, D.C. And I remember it was a great conversation, so I'm so glad he's joining us today. Gordon Vala Webb helps leaders of organizations improve their business results by transforming how their people collaborate, innovate, and share what they know. He's an award-winning social business and knowledge practitioner.
To have a distribution list for sending out the reminders before every
that's good.
Yeah, you can use the same one, but for reminders for each workshop. And sometimes we send to more than people. So you have to have a distribution list.
There is a mute all button. Could I ask everybody, just remind everyone to mute your microphones on your end? Thank you so much. Okay, let me get back to the introduction. Gordon has 12 years of experience working with large and complex public and private sector organizations. Most recently, he was National Director of KM for PwC Canada and led the Business Value Design team as part of the selection and rollout of a global social networking platform across PwC's network of firms. This is 155,000 people covering more than 150 countries. So this platform won Jive's Best in Show New Ways in Business in 2012. And on the website, Gordon has provided a link to that. So let me turn the presentation over to Gordon. And I'm going to put everybody on mute. And all right, Gordon, let's make sure that you are not muted.
I've just unmuted myself. Hi, it's Gordon here. Looks like I'm now sharing my desktop. I wonder, Denise, if you can get back to the slides or whether I should just go to mine. Any thoughts on that, Denise?
I can advance them for you.
You know what? I have them right here. So why don't I just put them up?
There you go. You're fine.
I lost sight of them. So let me just. We're
seeing them.
All right. So it's just taking a while to refresh on my computer, I guess. Hang on a second while I get them back. Probably in the middle. I'm looking at a black screen right now, so that's not helpful from my point of view. So so why don't we slideshow from the beginning? All right. So hopefully you're looking at the title slide again. Excellent. So, well, thank you everyone for coming, and Denise and the team at KM at Kent for this opportunity. I'm excited to be part of the webinar series, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations as they come through. So why don't we get started? So the agenda today, I'll just do a little bit of further background on me and talk about why it is that I think we need smarter organizations and what are the response, at least as far as I see it, that's been so far. It's a bit harsh perhaps, but I asked a question, so why is it that our organizations are dumb? And then propose an approach and some alternatives that we can use to improve that situation. And finally, offer you light at the end of the tunnel. No, it's not a train coming towards you, but it's you know, the future, a very positive state, I think. So Denise is going to handle the questions on the chat side. So if you have a question, if you can ask it to Denise or to the broader group through chat, and I'll stop at appropriate places to check in. So first, introductions. Kind of hard to know who you are. I hear from Denise that it's a variety of folks, not just in terms of the kinds of people, but also the geographic location. So I'd certainly be delighted to hear from you after the session if you have further questions or want to connect in some fashion. So there's a picture of me. As Denise mentioned, previously I was the KM director at PwC in Canada. I also had the same role creating and building a KM program at a government agency here in Canada. Right now I work on my own, providing advice and teaching under the sort of dynamic adaptation company name. I was the global lead for design and business value for PwC's rollout of their what turned out to be Jive, a social networking platform. You know, beyond that, I've had 15 years in the public sector. I was in the no-profit sector, a part of a startup company that went to one of the many that went nowhere. So I have that experience, and I also have considerable experience on the nonprofit side. I chair a board of directors of the largest North American provider of occupational health and safety consulting, training, and information products. So I kind of have a sense of a variety of different organizations, and let me talk about why it is that I think we need smarter organizations. I think first of all, you know, Drucker as a touchstone for looking at business and management. This feels intuitively true to me, that somehow management makes it hard for people to get their work done, and that's you know, that's part of the problem. That's an ugly extra slide I threw in. You know, part of you know, I think part of that leads to an incredible amount of disengagement. This is that number there, startlingly high number, comes from a Gallup poll. 71% of employees feel that they are not engaged or actively disengaged from their work. And part of the result of that is, and this is just one, I think, symptom of that, is a huge cost in terms of people sick or claiming to be sick. Presenteeism, a lovely term, showing up for work but not actually being present, or rather being present without really being present. And this is a UK number, but there are many other numbers for equivalent economies. Debs is a tip to the hat to a socialist president candidate for the U.S. back at the turn of the early in the 20th century, led the international workers of the world. So, I mean, if you think about it, you know, sheep are slow, follow the flock. They're not very fun. They can't fly. And I propose that many, particularly large organizations, show the same kind of characteristics. They're slow. They follow what everyone else does. They're not very fun to work in, and it certainly doesn't feel like they're flying. So, you know, it's particularly important to deal with this question about how smart organizations are, because in the old world, going back post-Second World War, the world was fairly stable. Repeatable processes were king. Authoritative knowledge was the sort of benchmark, and there were huge strides made in terms of productivity and living conditions based on organizations that understood and were successful in that so-called old world. In the new world, however, I think the world is much more complex than it was. Instead of repeatable processes, we are running into much more discontinuity, new business models based on new technologies, transportation, information, are just having a tremendous impact on sort of the environment out there. And knowledge, what we know, is becoming much more ambiguous. What was true yesterday may not be true today in terms of understanding from a business point of view what to do, how to do it. So, and the pressure is mounting. You just have to read any, well, I was going to say business section, but basically any newspaper today, you'll see these themes coming out. More competition, power shifting, slow economic growth, particularly in the sort of Western industrialized economies in particular, youth unemployment, public sector fiscal crises. By the way, we hope that, I'm in Canada, by the way, and we certainly all hope that the sequestering thing works, and that would do us all well. And what happens to organizations if they don't get it right is extinction. Here's a chart showing the average lifetime of S&P 500 companies, declining from, a high of around 75 years just post the depression, the U.S. depression, now to 2010, down to 15 years. Now, of course, there are mergers and acquisitions in there, but it really is quite an astonishing thing to see the sort of the sort of degree of change that's happening in large organizations. So, what has been, maybe I'll just pause there and just see if anyone has any questions, Denise, from the chat side of things.
Gordon, thank you. Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Actually, Edwin has a question, so let me unmute him. It's a very interesting question. Edwin, go ahead.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. From Southern Arizona, I asked this question. It's HR related as far as you're talking about the capacities of organizations being limited by those that are disengaged. So the question is, how do we, or organizations, hire for adaptability and open learner type facets or characteristics to match the engaged knowledge culture?
Edwin, a good question. I suspect part of the answer to that would be embedded in looking who in your current organization exhibit those kind of characteristics. And one approach is to sort of work through their social networks to identify others that would sort of fit the profile that you're looking for. Second off, I would say, I think if you're at that point where you do have an agile organization, an adaptable organization where people are engaged, you're tremendously fortunate, and you should do everything to help make sure that that doesn't slip away from you. So I'm sorry that that's not a full response, but I think that that's sort of recruiting through social networks for like people might be one tactic.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, there are sort of psychometric testing that you can do that some organizations try. I think you're going to have to work pretty hard to find the right test, and of course be very careful not to not to over-rely on it. The third thing that occurs to me is I think if you look at people's sort of extracurricular activities, have they been a member of a band or choir? You know, what other things do they do in their lives, demonstrating, I think, the ability to connect and build networks with other people, sustain relationships, be sort of innovative, creative. I think you can look for those markers in sort of the other things that people do outside of their work. We can chat more if you'd like later, but those are the ones that occur to me.
Thank you.
I mean, so I'll just carry on, and we'll stop again in a short little bit. I think arguably the response so far to those kind of pressures that many organizations have been feeling is, in general, sort of this notion of sort of belt tightening. You know, cries to work harder. Of course, lots of people trying to control costs, putting people off to work, business process re-engineering, mergers and acquisitions, many of those of which are actually not successful and do not lead to the sort of economies of scale or that had sort of generated them, the sort of thinking in the first place. And I think we can sort of we're going to look at why it is that larger organizations, in fact, don't become more productive. They typically become less productive. Offshoring is another classic one. Offshoring of work. This is happening in many organizations, and you know, some of these things, in fact, do for a period of time, you know, help the organization sort of maintain itself. But I would argue there are limits to all of those approaches, and more to come. Remote working, sort of cloud computing are a couple. Remote working, I think, is people are really, this is related to cost control. So people are trying to reduce their floor, the amount of space they are occupying on the floors in expensive office buildings, for example, and looking to get that work done remotely, then having to deal with the sort of the difficulties of sort of switching from the command and control sort of approach that people take and managing people remotely doesn't work very particularly well from a command and control point of view, unless you're sort of more in a sort of routine work kind of situation. So I'll ask the provocative questions. So, you know, why are our organizations dumb? Maybe I can demonstrate first that they are, in fact, can be considered dumb. It's fascinating to me that when you look at cities as they get larger, in this case, you're looking at a couple of charts where these are the size of city graphed against the various sort of measures of productivity, wealth. There is a pretty strong relationship that as cities double in size, they become 15% wealthier for each increase. It's fascinating to me when you look at cities, so that cities are the top line, compared to companies, so that divided out into various industries. You'll see that cities show this, you know, this pattern of increased productivity, and yet, for example, healthcare and utilities are basically flat, depending on increase in size. And many organizations, most notably the financial ones, get less smart as they increase in size. Now, if you look at this for sort of large organizations, all those pretty colors there are showing all of the different industries. You can see there's a general sort of downward sloping, so that for companies over 1,000 people, for sort of each order of magnitude of increase, so from 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000, the productivity of workers drop by more than a quarter. So just to go back a bit, as cities increase in size, as they double in size on average, they increase by 15%. For order of magnitude increases in companies, there's a steady drop. Now, there's a fair amount of dispersal. You'll see there are some people that are above that line and some below the line, but on average, there's this 25% drop for larger companies. You know, at the same time, work has been getting smarter. So you'll see this is using 1969 as a sort of benchmark year. Expert thinking and complex communication, those are the top two lines, are the sort of portion of work. This is a U.S. Data. There's more and more of it, you know, and the routine manual routine cognitive work has been dropping. I don't think there's any surprise there. Of course, the impact of computer technologies has been replacing sort of more and more routine work, or it's been offshore, as we were talking about earlier. It's now making up, this is sort of slightly different figures, but you can see that in the United States, it's sort of interactions jobs. So these are jobs that require sort of higher level thinking, are now constituting 41%, and a growing percentage of the jobs in the U.S. and likewise in Germany. You can see other countries are behind, but those numbers are growing as well. So the work has been getting smarter, but the productivity of at least larger firms, 1,000 and above, the larger you get, the more the sort of loss in at least relative productivity. Of course, if you're 10 times larger but only 25% less productive, you're still making lots of money. It's just amazing that size seems to reduce the efficiency of organizations, despite a large proportion of sort of interaction work, higher mental processing kind of work. I think there's three reasons for that. There's something I would call the maze tricks. There's a question of a gap between sort of in terms of the complexity of the internal processes and the impact that has on the proportion of high performers, and the overhang of old think, what I call old think. So let's look at the maze. You know, we have these hierarchically organized silos. You know, the big cheese, there's second level cheeses, and third level and fourth level, and they're divided across geographical boundaries. So you have these matrices, which has been a response to, I think, the increased environmental complexity that organizations face. So, you know, you can't have one single hierarchy covering everybody in all locations, so you devise a matrix so that you can try to coordinate people across different functional areas, different geographical areas at the same time. At PwC, where I worked, you know, we were divided by geography, line of service, industry, and market segment. And you know, a person in PwC might have 3 or 4 different leaders who were leading them along those different axes. So, you know, hierarchy and silos optimize within the silo, but it makes it very difficult to do that across silos. Here's an example I rather like. This is sort of mapping out, trying to make a contract change at an aerospace company. The study shows 125 individuals with more than 700 interactions to approve a contract change. And not surprisingly, when you're sort of engaged in that, then, you know, the symptoms of the maze tricks would be very familiar to anyone involved in a large organization. You know, this huge growth of sort of decision intersection points, fuzzy reporting lines, meeting and email overload, the sort of frustration not being able to see the whole picture, and sort of in general decision paralysis. The coffee mug on the right-hand side, there's actually a link at the bottom. You can actually go order that coffee mug if you want. I captured it in lieu of the many Dilbert cartoons that I could have used here. So the other piece is this gap between the sort of complexity of organizations and the percentage of highly engaged and performing staff. So as the complexity of organizations increase, there's a tendency to institute more and more sort of management rules, bureaucracy. What this does is have a effect of that if you do have highly performing staff, highly engaged staff that become frustrated with all of these rules and procedures, they tend to leave organizations that are like that. You then hire other people who are less high performing and less engaged, which means you need to get more management, more rules, more bureaucracy, and it becomes a bit of a nightmare. So this sort of complexity of organizations driving more rules and management and sort of disengaging staff, I think is a real problem. Management, this goes back to the Drucker point, management loves sort of certainty and they love rules and adherence to rules and direct measurement, but it does have a tendency of disengaging staff. So, some of the symptoms of that, the bureaucracy we already talked about, there's over-engineering, waiting times, inefficient processes. We've probably all experienced those as well. The other thing I think is an overhang of what the old think. There's basically an ideology that's in place, a kind of control culture that pervades thinking in many large organizations. There's an emphasis on external rewards. There's an emphasis. There's a belief that humans are sort of thinking animals. So if you just give them enough information, the rational brain will choose across all of the possible scenarios the right one. That people are sort of fundamentally selfish, and that people are relatively immutable. That their brain is fixed. They are what they are. I think there's an alternative to that old thinking, a sort of a new thinking approach. Taking what I would call, or what's been called, an integrative culture approach, thinking of people as feeling animals, that we feel first and sort of think second. That little amygdala at the base of the brain sort of kicks in with a reward, fear kind of response. That people are highly internally motivated. This makes reference to Daniel Pink and all of his work and many others in this area, and that people fundamentally want to be connected to other people. This is an important part of being human, and in fact that our brains are plastic, that there's lots of work around neuroplasticity and the ability to focus our attention and actually change the way we think, and which has an actual physical impact in terms of the way the brain is wired. This old think, here's a prof from Harvard Business School. I like this one. Historically imprinted with a hierarchical model. I think that, as I say, I think it's an ideology that many of our leaders have and believe in. And what are the symptoms of old think? You can see it in command and sort of broadcast approaches by leadership, using SMART performance goals. There's a wonderful Harvard Business School working paper entitled "Goals Gone Wild," which is an analysis and a critique of SMART performance goals and how they debilitate organizations where even a relatively small amount of collaboration and creativity is required. The focus on monetary rewards, focused on high performers, kind of a general fault finding. The chart I threw in at the bottom is, why do people participate in social business activities in organizations? I think it's remarkable that meeting formal performance goals and earning rewards are right at the very, very bottom of that chart. So people are engaged in social business activities. These are sort of using social networking tools within an organization for the reasons you see at the top of the chart, not because they actually meet anybody's goals or they actually earn money. Why don't I pause there and see if I provoked anyone to ask a question.
Gordon, we have a question again from Edwin. Let me
Excellent.
make sure Edwin is unmuted again. Edwin.
Hello.
Go ahead.
All right, sir. Going back to, there was a slide that you showed that compared cultures and/or geographic representations of the type of work being done by percentages.
I'm trying to find it.
Right there. That's it. That's it.
This one?
Right there. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So my question was, by definition, production jobs in the classical sense of the development of industrial items my question exactly was on the transaction jobs. Does food service count as a transaction job or a production job?
You know what, Evan? I don't know. There's a reference at the bottom of the chart to the McKinsey study that comes out of. So okay. My suggestion would be you follow that and see what the definition. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, in general, I think the idea is there are my guess would be that there are service transaction jobs that don't require a great deal of the sort of higher level kind of expert thinking, judgment making, or complex communication, communicating complex ideas, negotiating around complex issues. And it would they're more likely to fall into routine cognitive, what's your order, what's your change, do you have any, you have a 1 of 50 standard issues or complaints that someone on a help desk is resolving. That's what I would imagine are in those transaction jobs, but I'm sorry, you'll have to go back and look at the study.
All right, I'll do that. And the second question was closer to the end of where you were just at. The question was, how do we measure and/or reward knowledge sharing and/or building or lack thereof?
Well, you know what? Let's go into the what we can do about it, and maybe we can circle back on that question.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So
I'll carry on unless there's we'll have a chance to sort of pick up some more. So what can be done? Is it entirely bleak? This is a study of U.S. banks. So you'll see at the bottom of the chart, it's kind of asset growth compounded over the last sort of 10 years up to 2011. So these are all banks that experienced, well, most of them experienced growth. You'll see the zero is not quite in the bottom left-hand corner, but many of the banks experienced growth. And the pink area below the zero is where efficiency deteriorated. So only 30% of the banks were able to improve their efficiency while maintaining growth. So clearly, the majority, 70% in this case, were not able to increase their efficiency when they grew, but some were. So I think there is hope, and I'm going to offer a couple of suggestions for how it is that that can happen across larger organizations. And I think there are 3 approaches. They're interlinked, and I would propose that you would probably, I mean, there's always a question of where you want to start, but to some extent you need to do all three of them in order to be, I would argue, successful in making your organization smarter. So the first one is sort of a leadership renewal. There's the picture on the right-hand side is the King of Iran. Back in the 19th century. I have no idea what kind of ruler he was. I just chose the image because I thought it was so wonderful. Philip Slater, in his book, The Chrysalis Effect, that's the quote there, talks about in a healthy system, information flows are unimpeded by clots of power or the sclerosis of hierarchy. I think it's a marvelous quote, and I think it gives us some hope, for example, in terms of sustaining competitive advantage against countries like China, where arguably information, not arguably, I think it's demonstrably true, that information flows are in fact impeded by clots of power. And I would argue that to some extent, large organizations have the same impeded flows of information, and part of the solution is to sort of break down hierarchy and sort of take a different approach. There's a wonderful quote, the fish rots from, sort of old proverb, the fish rots from the head down. I was doing some research on that. Apparently every single culture in the world basically claims this as their own proverb. But I mean, the nature of the leadership renewal that we need to go through, I think, is to reject this control culture. Philip Slater, in that book I just was talking about, speaks about the sort of nature of the control culture. It actually sort of has a thousands of year history behind it, and leaders have to establish shared goals with the people that are in those organizations, connect with people through conversations, embrace emergence, work towards transparency and decision making. Build trust, learn to use social media, because I think we'll see in the next section, I think the use of social media within an organization is a powerful way for leaders to, in fact, connect through conversation to the many people that work in organizations, and to sort of move towards this, empathy rather than egotism. The Jack Welch quote there in the corner, I think, is absolutely true. It's hard to do, but it also creates the hard results. And ironically, of course, many leaders in corporate Canada and corporate America and corporate otherwise don't see the opportunities here. The second thing we need is a new organizational bicycle. And by that I mean a reference to Wilson Miner. A computer is a bicycle for the mind. Human beings apparently are not very efficient in terms of moving themselves around the planet. The condor is the most efficient animal in the world in terms of converting energy to sort of travel. But if you give a human being a bicycle, they are immensely more efficient than even a condor is. And in the same way, computers do that for our mind. And I would argue that we need a new bicycle within organizations. We need to sort of kill email, because emails and the systems behind it are closed and private systems. They lock up knowledge. They reduce the ease of sharing and idea flowing. And social networking within organizations change the model to a kind of open, sharing, transparent one, where information and ideas can flow much more easily both across the organization currently and also over time, because that material is held and is searchable and findable, discoverable after the fact. And in essence, we need to move from these non-social bicycles, email systems, or file sharing systems that are closed or based on a push sort of spam model. Leaders can spam you. They can send you an email, whether you want to get it or not, because they're the big cheese. And move to a much more open set of technologies using social networking platforms. And by that I mean platforms that can do a variety of things, sort of microblogging, messaging, blogs, wikis, quickly and easily forming group spaces where people can share and have discussions over materials, be able to operate across many groups, enable people to find each other based on the conversations that they've had, the material that they posted, the things that they're interested in. There's a little quote at the bottom by Marshall McLuhan. You know, this is around the, so often you hear questions of, well, you know, it's just tools. Well, I think, you know, our culture shapes the tools, and then, as McLuhan says, the tools begin to shape us. So I think a combination of leadership renewal with new tools, a new bicycle for the mind inside of the organization would be immensely powerful in terms of making organizations smarter. And you know, it's not just. I would like to make the point. It's not just sort of the flow of information sort of inside the organization, but it's also outside the organization, and it's what I would call what's been called the near side. So those are people that are closely related to your organization. They are your suppliers, partners. They are your alumni. They can be a tremendous resource and capability to the organization, helping the organization sense what's going on in the marketplace, in the environment, a source of information and knowledge and ideas. So the new bicycle has to operate across those different spaces to draw them in. Now, I mean, I would say that there are, it's not like you can simply turn these things on. There are lots of issues related to the rollout of social networking platforms inside of enterprises, but they all can be solved. And I think the advantage to making your organization smarter are quite tremendous. And finally, I think going back to that earlier slide around increasing complexity in organizations, I actually think that we need to be careful about managing down the complexity of organizations. There are a large amount of sort of hidden costs, both sort of hard costs in terms of reduced efficiency, but also the more subtle costs like the disengagement of workers that you get when you have complexity beyond what's required for your business to operate. And you actually need to actively try to manage down the complexity of your products, your processes, your organizational capabilities. The simplest thing to do is simply add new products, new processes, new capabilities on top of old ones, and it just increases complexity and has those very negative impacts. Why don't I pause there? Edwin, do you want to ask your question again, so we can remind ourselves of it?
You bet.
Thanks. Go ahead.
How do we measure or reward knowledge sharing and/or building or lack thereof?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different answers to that. First off, if you create the right kind of leadership and the culture, the integrative culture, people will become sort of, as they become more engaged, more connected, they will naturally want to share their ideas, their knowledge. They'll feel more comfortable doing so. I think there will be an improvement in sort of knowledge sharing and idea sharing, sort of in and of itself, and the technology can certainly help foster and support that. If you have it can be hard to share an idea or get an answer to a question. The second thing is in terms of measurement, there's been a bunch of work around sort of how do you measure activities within social networking platforms in terms of knowledge sharing. Typically they're activity-based, the number of discussion postings, question answers to questions, so you can measure the activity. It's a subtle thing to understand whether or not things are actually, there is increased knowledge sharing. At PwC, the approach we took in terms of the rollout of the platform that we did, we basically, before we rolled out the platform, we sort of took did a benchmark survey of people, asking them how easy was it to get information, how easy was it to share ideas, for example. And the plan was after a year to repeat the survey and look at the difference between the two results, and I think more interestingly, sort of match up the survey results to people's activities within the platform. And ideally what we were trying to look at was to sort of demonstrate that people that found it easier to get what they needed to know, that they would find out what they needed to know or share what they knew or their ideas, would be ones who were also demonstrating the behavior in the social networking platform. So that was the approach we're taking. We haven't got to the end of the year yet in terms of the PwC rollout, so I can't report on those results.
I have a question from Annie Green and
sure.
A comment from Bert. So let me make sure. Annie, go ahead, please. Annie, can you? Do you have audio? Oops, I'm not sure Annie can. Let me read you Annie's question.
Sure.
Annie asks, what do you think about employee renewal?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. All right. I'm not sure that Annie can participate directly. It looks like she's on the cell phone.
Denise, can you hear me now?
There she is. We got.
Yeah, I just.
Oh.
Okay, hold on. Can you am I coming in clear?
You're coming through clear, thanks.
Okay, let me turn it up a little bit. Okay, can you still hear me?
You're fine.
Yep.
Okay. What I meant was when you said leadership renewal, which I think is really great, and I'm enjoying the presentation, but I think that leadership has kind of built a culture in organizations that is kind of a double-edged sword, so to speak, and a lot of it's based on credentialing, and I'm looking mainly in the engineering and IT type of field. Leadership, as you've said, through complexity and also managing bureaucracy, has leaned heavily on credentialing organizations to identify people's skills and capabilities. So what that does is it drives the current employee to seek these credentials, and a lot of times they seek it without having had the experience or the backing necessary in order to occupy the credential. So what it drives is leadership having caused them to feel like they have to have this type of credentialing, and then they have to live up to that bill. And unfortunately, they can't. So it causes deviant work habits, whereas there's a lot of hiding, or there's a lot of backbiting, or there's a lot of things to stay afloat. Because, you know, most employees, if they don't find success or they don't get success, then they're going to be dissatisfied. So in an environment like that, I'm thinking that, yes, leadership may need to be renewed, but we also need to somehow renew the employees so that they have a different mindset about this type of environment.
Annie, Gordon here. Thanks for your question, and I'm glad you're enjoying the presentation. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, leadership renewal is really what I've suggested here. The three key elements are the sort of starting point, but I think at the end of the day, everyone within organizations are going to be need to be renewed. So in an organization where there's command and control and a lack of authenticity and a sort of focus on going through paper hoops like credentialing, you get the behavior that you basically expect. So if the leadership in such an organization starts to become more honest and transparent with people and engage in an authentic way with their people, and I think that will drive people to operate and think differently. I don't want to minimize the degree of difficulty in sort of creating, changing a culture over from a command one to a more integrative one. But I think it's the positive benefits, both personally to people, that they're more engaged with their work, or they find that they're actually in the wrong work at the wrong in the wrong place. That can also be liberating in a way. Lots of difficulties, I think, making the transition, but I can't think of anything worse than going to a job that you don't like, or you're not really, in your heart of hearts, you're really not up to it, or where you have, people are looking to undercut you as much as they can. So I think you're right. It's a much broader leadership, much broader renewal than simply the leadership. But I think it has to start at the leadership to sort of drive the change.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, I think Bert had a comment. Bert, did you want to share your comment, or?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I enjoying the presentation very much as well, and appreciate you mentioning how hard it is in your most recent answer to change a culture. I guess when you listed, the limitations and complexities, that can make some of this difficult, I think it's not the focus of the presentation, but some of those are real and legitimate obstacles in certain types of organizations with a lot of regulation governing what they do. I think the open use of social tools in a highly regulated environment or industry is more than a challenge. I think it's extremely difficult.
Two things. I mean, I have worked and sort of led change in a large sort of 6,000 person government agency. Everyone, the leadership's major concern every day of the year was, how do we stay off the front pages of the local newspaper? That was their starting point for basically everything they did. So, we were risk adverse. We were hidebound with under the legislation and regulation that governed us. We had a collective agreement that bound us to work rules. It was very difficult to make change. So I certainly understand the difficulties. My experience, though, in that organization is that, however, when people get people are so much, yearning to be free, both leaders and, the people, that it can be, people can suddenly become much more creative about finding ways to make things work within the, legislative or regulatory regime. PwC on the accounting side is a regulated industry, and certainly there were lots and lots of issues around managing risks, client confidentiality, intellectual property leakage, brand and reputational risks. We had an entire work stream devoted to those legal and risk issues, many of which were directly related to the regulatory environment. So they are certainly, they deserve a lot of attention as part of the change effort. But I simply do not accept that, that there are not ways to both design the platform, and in fact, our design as I mentioned, I led the design work team stream for our implementation of Jive. Part of our design from the very beginning incorporated how is it that we support our risk management issues related to the regulatory compliance that we had. So we built that into our screens, and that was part of the mitigation that we used with the risk management people that were worried about the regulatory compliance requirements. So my view is it can be done. It does take work. It does take some creativity. It does take some educating of the sort of people who worry about that risk. And it takes some educating of yourself in terms of what those regulatory requirements are. But it can be done. You know, PwC is a very risk-adverse, very organization that's very much concerned about staying on the inside of any of its rules or requirements. So I offer some hope and agree with the caveat that it would take a lot of work to get there. Denise, is there any other questions? I mean, maybe I could. I'm just going to finish up here. Then we can sort of carry on if people have any more comments. You know, if we get it right, you know, well, if we get it wrong, is the lovely quote from Charles Darwin. I think this applies both at an organizational level and at a sort of country or territory level. You know, if we get it right, you know, here's a pastiche of different improvements that can be expected in the use of sort of social networking, enterprise social media type approaches. You know, 20% improvements here, 30% there. You know, related to that, you know, McKinsey argued in a recent report of 20 to 25% increase in productivities. You know, Google demonstrates, you know, that you can, as an organization, you can, you know, grow and demonstrate value. And the IBM study there found that high performers across 1,700 of global CEOs rather, characterized, you know, openness as a key influence on their organization. So, I mean, I think there is, this is the light at the end of the tunnel for people. I think it's tremendously difficult to get. My experience tells me that most organizational leaders got there because they are comfortable sort of optimizing the past. So, you know, that they are good at running what already exists, and they have a hard time. They're not naturally inclined to look at you know, what could be, what the future might be. And they have a hard time sort of moving into areas of sort of uncertainty and you know, creation by exploration, which I think is required here. So I don't want to mitigate I don't want to minimize the difficulty of trying to get leadership to understand this, but I think there are tremendous opportunities, and I would go back to Charles Darwin that perhaps you know, as the choice becomes starker for organizational leadership, they will start to look at these alternatives that really shape the foundation of their world to the very core. And why don't I just end off there? We're just about at the top of the hour. Happy to take any more questions or comments that people have. If you want to contact me, here's my contact information.
And I'll just mention that Gordon's slides will be available on his speaker page at the wiki, and we'll have a recording of posted as well this afternoon. I think this has been a great presentation. I want to thank Gordon so much. And if you want to listen to this again, it was so rich in terms of ideas, you'll probably want to listen to it again. And I know some of you have already mentioned you're taking things from it already. Some of your ideas, Gordon, are already on people's walls, and I think we're going to hear some of this. So is there any open discussion or questions? I think everybody says thank you very much. Oh, Bert did have a question, which actually, Bert, since you've sent that privately, do you want to ask it publicly, or do you want to contact Gordon directly?
Sure. I was wondering whether he mentioned that the PwC program is, still being rolled out. Will there be any published paper, report, or blog about the success and challenges of that project?
Sure. Yeah, so I can give you a brief update. I heard yesterday that after 9 months, they have 100,000 people worldwide who have signed up. That's out of a worldwide, total population of 155,000 people in PwC. The claim I heard, the report I got yesterday, was that the adoption of the social networking platform has been faster than they saw with email. There is a slide deck that sort of reviews the business value and some of the challenges. Part of a presentation that was made as part of a Jive webinar, actually, that happened yesterday. So there's a PDF of the slides, and if you go to my website, the Dynamic Adaptation, go to the resources section. There's a link there to it. If you have any trouble finding it, just pop me an email, and I can flip you the link or get you a copy to you. So that's all that's sort of been, as far as I know, that's the best that's available right now in terms of what they did and why they did it, how they did it.
Great, thank you.
I'm sorry, Gordon, we have a question from Richard. Richard, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Oh, yeah. My organization, there's a number of scientists that are really reticent to sharing their ideas and collaborating because of a relatively small number of people who have stolen ideas and running off with proposals, basically their ideas. And, I would say management is not real sensitive to the issue, but it's having a pretty major impact.
Yeah, sure. Gordon here. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I started out with leadership renewal, because if the leadership doesn't sort of, demonstrate and sort of reinforce the behaviors, I think, a culture of attribution back to the original idea, the source of the idea, is absolutely fundamentally, it has to be fundamentally part of an organization. In PwC, we had this problem where people were afraid to, PwC has this big, we live and die on PowerPoint slides. And people were afraid to share their slide decks because they thought that people would just come along and grab the slide and use it again without attribution back to the source, without recognition for the effort that went into it. So one of the things we did was we started to make slide decks available, for example, as part of a video presentation. You can do that in PowerPoint. You just record a voiceover to the slides. So people would be able to see the slides, get a sense of the presentation, but if they actually wanted the slides themselves, they would actually have to approach the person who had the slides and get them from him or her explain what they were intending to do, and they sort of could negotiate involvement or attribution. It's not, it doesn't solve the attribution problem directly, but it's partially a partial solution. In social networking platforms, of course, it's very easy to see where did the idea come from first. Someone posted an idea in one group, there's a record of when it was posted, who it was posted by. If someone else pops up the same idea somewhere else, you can quickly, first of all, there's transparency, you can identify it, and second of all, you can demonstrate that that idea came from over here. Then it's a question of what's the impact, and I think that gets back to you're trying to develop a culture of attribution and recognition where people refer back to what's gone on before, and that you need leaders to kind of enforce that norming. So I'm not sure that without the leadership beginning to reinforce those norms. I think it's difficult. Scientists are, within an organization, scientists are a bit torn between sharing and having conversations with people in order to generate new insights and learn more, with this, with this fear that, I'm not going to get recognized for my work, my contribution, and that could have a, some sort of impact in terms of my performance recognition and or keeping my job. So it's a difficult one unless you've got the right culture in place.
Excellent. Gordon, thank you so much. This was great. I know we've all taken away a lot. So thank you so much for taking the time today. And I know that there are many other topics you've been working on, so we're hoping you'll come back and present on some of those other topics.
Thank you for the opportunity. Love talking about this stuff. If there's anyone in Toronto, we're actually organizing a conference on this topic in May. So let me know if you're in Toronto, you'd be interested, and I can give you that information. And delighted to come back. There is lots more richness in any one of these areas that I'd love to delve into. So, but thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate people's attention.
Gordon, can you send us information on that conference, and we'll post it to our website?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, everybody. And as I said, the archived recording of the webinar today should be up this afternoon. Thank you.
So let me just...
We're seeing them.
All right, so it's just taking a while to refresh on my computer, I guess. Hang on a second while I get them back. Probably in the middle. I'm looking at a black screen right now, so that's not helpful from my point of view. So one of the so why don't we slideshow from the beginning? All right. So hopefully you're looking at the title slide again. Excellent. So, well, thank you everyone for coming, and Denise and the team at KM at Kent for this opportunity. I'm excited to be part of the webinar series, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations as they come through. So why don't we get started? So the agenda today, I'll just do a little bit of further background on me and talk about why it is that I think we need smarter organizations, and what are the response, at least as far as I see it, that's been so far. It's a bit harsh perhaps, but I asked a question, so why is it that our organizations are dumb? And then propose an approach and some alternatives that we can use to improve that situation. And finally, offer you light at the end of the tunnel. No, it's not a train coming towards you, but it's the future, a very positive state, I think. So Denise is going to handle the questions on the chat side. So if you have a question, if you can ask it to Denise or to the broader group through chat, and I'll stop at appropriate places to check in. So first, introductions. Kind of hard to know who you are. I hear from Denise that it's a variety of folks, not just in terms of the kinds of people, but also the geographic location. So I'd certainly be delighted to hear from you after the session if you have further questions or want to connect in some fashion. So there's a picture of me. As Denise mentioned, previously I was the KM director at PwC in Canada. I also had the same role creating and building a KM program at a government agency here in Canada. Right now I work on my own, providing advice and teaching under the sort of dynamic adaptation company name. I was the global lead for design and business value for PwC's rollout of their what turned out to be Jive, a social networking platform. You know, beyond that, I've had 15 years in the public.
Last week, I think we've had suggestions and volunteers for another 6 webinars. So please do keep the ideas coming. We will fit them all in. So just a reminder that this is an open forum which operates under a Creative Commons governance model. It's also a community without formal funding, so I just want to take a little time to acknowledge the contributions of my team at Kent State, including Jana Korzenko, our academic program coordinator, Nicole Stempak, and Jake Spiegler, our 2 graduate assistants. So now on to today's program. So I'd like to introduce to you all Gordon, covering more than 150 countries. So this platform won Jive's Best in Show New Ways in Business in 2012. And on the website, Gordon has provided a link to that. So let me turn the presentation over to Gordon, and I'm going to put everybody on mute. And all right, Gordon, let's make sure that you are not muted.
I've just unmuted myself. Hi, it's Gordon here. Looks like I'm now sharing my desktop. I wonder, Denise, if you can get back to the slides or whether I should just go to mine. Any thoughts on that, Denise?
I can advance them for you.
You know what? Let me. I have them right here. So why don't I just put them up?
There you go. You're fine.
I lost sight of them.
Vala Webb. I met Gordon, I think, about a year and a half ago at Stan Garfield's annual event in Washington, D.C. And I remember it was a great conversation, so I'm so glad he's joining us today. Gordon Vala Webb helps leaders of organizations improve their business results by transforming how their people collaborate, innovate, and share what they know. He's an award-winning social business and knowledge practitioner.
To have a distribution list for sending out the reminders before every
That's good.
yeah, we can use the same one, but for reminders for each workshop. And sometimes we send more than people. So you have to have a distribution list.
There's a mute all button. Could I ask everybody, just remind everyone to mute your microphones on your end? Thank you so much. Okay, let me get back to the introduction. Gordon has 12 years of experience working with large and complex public and private sector organizations. Most recently, he was National Director of KM for PwC Canada and led the Business Value Design team as part of the selection and rollout of a global social networking platform across PwC's network of firms. This is 155,000 people